We are good.
Happy Tuesday, wherever you are in the world today. We are back for the last of our identity series here at Ancestral Healing Center Cafe Chats. And we have, if you haven't had a chance to listen to Bernadette and Michael's stories, please go back and watch the last two episodes and hear how ancestral healing work has really helped shape their identity. And today, Bernadette and Michael will be interviewing me about my evolution with ancestral healing. So I am going to turn it over to Michael and Bernadette to get this show going.
So, Ruschelle, I was thinking, we've done a lot of talking in these last few weeks about Neville Goddard's work, about who am I, about identity. And one of the things that came up for me was the story that you said, and I think it was your great-grandfather, who was the immigrant that came here to the US and thought he was getting on a bus to go to Brooklyn. And he ended up on a bus that came to West Virginia, and because they needed coal miners. And my thought, what came up for me was, I know this is in the middle of your identity journey, but that's what stuck to me. Like, how is what you think about your identity based on that story?
Wow. Well, Bernadette, before we got on this call, I was actually going to start with the story of how I connected really deeply to my grandfather. And I think that it was my grandfather, it was my paternal grandfather. And that I did not meet him. He died a year before I was born. But during my illness, so I had a severe Lyme disease episode March 3rd of 2014. So during that illness, my grandfather's essence or spirit, or however you want to define it, really made itself present in my life at that time. So I've spent a lot of time trying to understand and kind of go over the stories of my paternal grandfather, because I think he and I have a special connection that, even though he's not alive and I didn't get to meet him, we are really connected. So how did that specific story influence me? I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about that story specifically. It was just kind of a running joke that my mom and dad always told about, this kind of idea that on some level, when you're an immigrant during that time to the United States, there's some trickery that had gone on. There was back in Italy, there was certain propaganda that you would come to the US and have this really amazing life, and it was just this abundant place of opportunity. And then what actually happened was you end up walking 5 miles a day back and forth to a coal mine, and you spend 8 to 12 hours in a hole that is 2.5 feet deep with a donkey. So, this was a trick. It was a little bit of a trick for a lot of people. And so how does that story influence me at all today? I think the myriad of ways that my grandfather's experience of being an outsider and not understanding his family, his children, he had a large disconnect between his kids because of the cultural difference, and doing the very best that he could in that environment, and how that impacted my dad. How he specifically parented my dad. He was a really loving dad. My dad loved him deeply. But, things were not emotionally very easy for my father. And all of that impacts me and who I am. All of those little details make up me, and to say that all of those stories are stored in my body which is what I experienced when I got sick. I had this rupture of understanding that my illness was directly related to my granddad's trauma of coming to the United States. So, yeah,
Well,
that was a lot. So.
No, but it is, and it's fascinating the way you took that, because my thought was you could have been a Brooklynite, you instead of you're a West Virginia, you know what I mean? And they're so different in that your identity, where we end up through exactly what you had said, where there was trickery and he thought he was going to Brooklyn and he ended up in West Virginia, and how that impacted you. So I think you actually, explained it really well, because of the fact that it doesn't matter where you end up, that where that ending up is where your identity comes from.
And, on this channel, we've talked about place a lot. And so I'm glad you've circled back to that. You're exactly right. If I'd grown up in Brooklyn, if my grandfather had stayed where his sister lived, his sister did live near the Brooklyn Bridge and had a fruit stand or something. If he had stayed there, I would be a completely different person. But he decided to take this adventure down into the mountains, and I have I'm the type of person that loves the place where I am. So, not everybody has that much of an attachment to the mountains where they grew up, or the desert, or the valley. But I have a particular fondness for the mountains, and that has shaped my identity. I moved back to New York. I went to graduate school there, and I was fiercely proud of being from where I was, even though daily I was insulted daily because of my accent. And, it's interesting. My husband is an Indian immigrant, and he came to New York, and he never experienced racism or classism the way I experienced it. I had horrible experiences of classism in New York City, and it didn't seem to phase. It almost made me double down on being really proud of where I was from. And maybe that's an immigrant trait as well. I'm not sure. So,
Michael, do you have a thought? You're muted.
Right. One of the things I find fascinating about this work is that everybody comes to it on their own line, and no two stories are the same. And one thing I would say to anybody listening is that you don't have to have developed a connection with one of your dead ancestors before engaging with this work. You can come in on any line. But what I see is the way that identity is constructed from all of these different pieces. And it's when the stories are shut down this is my experience. Ruschelle, I'd be interested to see your take on this. As a result of your journey, what I see is where the stories were closed off and fallen silent, then the identity falls silent with it. And it's only through the reconstruction that we start to re-identify. And I'd be interested to know at what point you started realizing this was an identity journey, as well as a healing journey.
Well, I think that the experience of autoimmune disease or any type of illness is an identity defining one. And to know that was directly related, my illness was directly related to inherited trauma. It was, and on multiple levels. I mean, I can very quickly, I'll go over the stories again. So I got sick and had this dream of coals shedding out of my skin, right? That was my grandfather's. I also had a trauma at age 4 that was an inherited trauma. So my maternal grandfather had died when my mom was age 4. And I started having severe death anxiety at age 4. So we know that that's an inherited trauma. There was no reason for me at 4 years old to have severe death anxiety, except that it be genetically passed down to me. And what does that have to do with getting sick? We know that if a child has trauma, they are more likely to have chronic illness as an adult. So I directly link my death anxiety to me contracting and having such a severe reaction to Lyme disease as an adult. Lots of people have Lyme disease, but they don't get near as sick as what I was. Severely, deathly sick for years. So, I think, Michael, did that answer your question? I think I went on a tangent. Oh, the stories getting shut down. If I didn't know those stories, it would be harder for me to have a connection to the story, like oh, wait, I had a trauma at age 4 that resulted in me possibly getting sick. My grandfather had a traumatic working experience, and that came out in a dream and was shared to me about my own illness and healing. So I think it's interesting with ancestral healing work that when you start to do it, the stories will come to you from the most bizarre places. Like, you don't even have to have them written down or have had your mother tell you the stories. They'll just show up and help you. And I don't have an explanation for that. But
I have a question for you. How does somebody understand that the struggles that they're having or how they feel about themselves is related to identity? So we know because of the work that we've done, but how does somebody begin to realize, oh, it's because I don't know who I am. I've put myself in all of these, I'm this, and this, and none of them are something that's me. So how does somebody begin to understand that, from your perspective, from your understanding of how you began to understand who you are?
So the simplest way that I can explain it is that if you listen, so I've been a therapist for 25 years, and if you listen to the way someone talks about their current reality, let's say someone has Lyme disease. If you listen to the words that they use when they talk about what they're experiencing, and then you go back and you ask them to talk about the stories of their childhood or their family stories, you'll catch what I call a familiar feeling. And the familiar feeling is the evidence that it's the same story. Like for example, let's say I have neck pain and I'm telling you I have neck pain and I'm like, I don't know which way to turn. I've got too much, I'm like, I can't turn this way, it hurts. I can't turn that way, it hurts. I don't know which way to turn that I'm not in pain. And then that same person would tell a story about their father being in some sort of litigation where he didn't know which way to turn. I mean, that is the body internalizing a trauma. And that's exactly what, after I started peeling back the layers of how sick I was, it was like, well, my goodness, that was a metaphor for that. And that was a metaphor for my grandma. And it was evident.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
On that line, I actually recovered at one point a somatic memory, which is a body memory, which I know it's an inherited one, and it's a head movement, an eye movement. And when I get the angle right and the declination of the head and of the eyes, I can feel I'm following a groove that's been there, since before I was born. And if I do something else, it's not the same movement, but when it's that familiar movement, you can feel it's like this well-oiled machine that's just there inside you.
Yeah. Yeah. So listening for the metaphors that are, and the words. Yeah.
No, I just think it was a great, that's a really great example because people don't recognize that they have things that they do that are related, where their behaviors come from. And that's a physical behavior where it's like your neck hurts and you don't, but it's so important to recognize what the identity of who we are, plays a part in that. Can you tell me a little bit about what you do you remember having an identity as a child, or do you remember adopting an identity? Was there anything that, as a young person, that you grabbed onto and said, this is who I am, even though, it wasn't necessarily?
So when I was, my earliest memory of an identity is actually one that I would maybe even consider a pre-life, like maybe a past life identity or a pre-life identity. I remember being very young and being in my bedroom and thinking, boy, none of this is all just like a TV show. None of this is real at all. And I was probably 6 or 7. And I was like, this is like this fake. And I'm not part of this reality. So that's my first memory of an identity, that I was something much larger than the house that I was in and the sister that I was and that sort of thing. But then I grew out of that a little bit. And my identity started to become, I was a Methodist girl from the South, and I was different because we were Italian immigrants, and we were from an Italian family, so I looked different. But I was very much, I was a part of my community in a lot of ways, but I was also a little bit different because I looked different from everybody else around me. And so those defining things started to become a little bit more concrete of who I am. And then some traumas happened in my life, and they shifted my identity. We had to move away from my home when I was 15. We moved a town over. And I was suddenly, one day I was this person and the next day I was this person because I was in a different place. And you can, I think the main point of that story is that our family was defined by that trauma because we were no longer close to our extended family. It was an issue. My uncle committed suicide in a very public way. There's like a real bad rupture. And so when we have traumas in the family, sometimes we're suddenly just thrust into a new identity. Suddenly I was the girl in the town next door who nobody knew and nobody cared anything about. And I wore a shirt that said I was Italian. And so everybody thought I couldn't speak English. I think we did. Right. So I was suddenly a complete and total outsider. And I'm sure everyone listening has similar stories to that in their adolescence.
My thought is, because I remember that moment for me as a child where I was like looking out into the world, and that's exactly what it feels like. Oh my gosh, like this, realizing that it did feel like I was in a play or in a, it didn't feel, but it's interesting because we lose that where we may have this real, almost spiritual recognition that we are bigger than, that this is not who we are. But then we have to it's the identity of who we're being told we are, and we have to go in and play that role. And as you said, yours switched when you left one place and went to another.
Yeah, it's very interesting, this notion of these events that literally just blow a family apart, a generation of family, is very interesting, because that's what I've been dealing with very recently. And in this case, it happened in 1925 when there, first of all, there'd been a very public prison trial and imprisonment, and then there were 2 deaths within 24 hours. And it just literally annihilated the family. And that meant there were no stories that you could tell, because as soon as you went to tell about those people, you were bringing in all of the stuff that nobody wanted to talk about. And I'm actually going down to London tomorrow to visit my great uncle's grave, to literally turn up physically in person to just lay these energies to rest. So I'm really fascinated by the experience, Ruschelle, that you've described of when you were being 15 and with your uncle's suicide. I think these moments are really critical moments in any family. I say this one that's been coursing in my family for a century. And I think these events just really rumble on. And this is where the ancestral healing work is so powerful in actually identifying these critical moments in our journeys.
I've really been loving this. I think maybe I mentioned it to you. I don't know if I mentioned it on a cafe chat, but we did a meditation about it, about calling ourselves back from these places. And I think what the nice overlap between Neville Goddard and ancestral healing is, like, we can do this internal meditation or prayer or whatever you want to call it around calling ourselves back from the moments of severe trauma and remembering that we're bigger, that we are that, little girl who was looking out of her eyes and thinking, this is ridiculous, right? Like, this is all a game or whatever. And that's who we actually are. And I think that's what Neville Goddard was trying to say. He was so good at saying it over and over and over in all these different ways. But what he wasn't good at or equipped at was trauma. Trauma wasn't really a language that was being used at the time. And he certainly didn't. I mean, I think he was an alcoholic, actually. There's hints of that Neville might have had really liked his cocktails. So, Neville was flawed in his own way. But the depth of his work can certainly, I think, impact and help us recover from trauma, but it's not explicit, right? Like, sometimes we need someone to sit with us and slow down the stories that are, like, too frightening to look at.
Some of his biggest, most important statements, he makes massive jumps in tiny sentences, and one of them is the trauma piece, and he knows there's something there, but as you say, he doesn't have the understanding or the language or the articulation to be able to go into it. And he talks about the need to let go of judgment, and he talks about the obvious things like nationality and race and religion and things, but if you follow that train down, you get to all of the judgments that have come down in the stories, like we're immigrants and so there's been some trickery, and all of, and we're Irish, and all of these things that have come down. And in my story, it was that we came from nowhere because we just bounced around and there was nothing, and those are all judgments as well. And it's not until you go in and actually identify where those things have come from and release them that you start to actualize some of what he's talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think what Neville Goddard did was opened up the conversation around this, and the deepening of understanding who we are. And there are others that are out there that are talking about it as well. And I think our stepping into this ourselves here is important, because this is something that everybody should be aware of, and understanding that identity has played a role, who they think they are or who they've been told they are, has played such an incredible role in their life. And when when we begin, there's this freedom when you begin to understand all the pieces that have affected you, whether it's trauma or whether it's, well, most of it's trauma, but, but you know, who we think we are, how we've been told that, and the freedom of coming to that recognition that I can actually go down and look and see who I am, and I think but Neville Goddard is, you know, he got the ball rolling, so to speak, or one of the ones who you know, began.
It's very clear to me that he understands that if you don't change the trajectory, then whatever the existing trajectory will continue. And he doesn't explicitly say this has come down ancestrally, but this is the piece where we can add into that story and deepen that story.
Yes. And I think that leads into like this other shift of how this work has really transformed my life. So, you know, I got sick, I got better, and then we moved back to West Virginia from New York, my husband and I, and I had a chance, it was COVID, so I had a chance to be quiet, and I started working on a book. And the book, Inherited Trauma and Family Wealth, which, you know, we're going to be doing some programming off of. The book was an attempt for me to, consciously, I was like, I'm going to synthesize my past 20 some years of doing therapy. But what was actually happening in writing the book was I was researching and digging through my own inherited trauma and family wealth. And the process of writing, that's why I talk a lot about writing. I think writing is a very powerful tool. The process of writing the book opened me up to having a better financial experience, and unlocking some of the poverty mindset, and you know, it shifted me from maybe like I'm just a therapist and that's all I can do, to unlocking that I'm capable of doing other things, and I don't have to be stuck in this caregiver role. And the caregiver role is this was an inherited role for me. It was a family dynamic role that served me in my immediate family, but it was also, you know, my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, she cared for wealthy people's children. That was her job. Most of her life. And what did I do? What was my first job in New York? I ended up being a live-in therapist to an adult child who needed cared for. That was my first job. Like, there's not a coincidence that my grandmother cared for wealthy people, and then I moved to the city and just made that bigger. You know, I just blew that role up. And how, you know, do we want to be locked in those roles?
Yeah.
Do we feel trapped in them? Or do, you know, if you're somebody listening and you're like, well, this is my job and this is all I know how to do. Well, is that actually right? Or is there maybe some story there that you're carrying forward that you actually don't have to continue to care for people as a profession? So.
Yeah. It's powerful. I mean, it just the whole conversation, every conversation around this is so powerful. And it just gives us I think for anybody listening who hasn't really gone on the journey yet, or it's enlightening to realize that this is something you can actually do. Like you don't have to stick with the story that you have had around yourself your whole life. And it doesn't matter if you were in your 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, you can at any time, you can go, okay, because there's a comfort when you understand who you are from the inside. And there's just this, I don't know, it's kind of amazing.
Well, maybe that's a good segue for Bernadette And Michael, if you'd like to comment as well on the introductory tool that Bernadette, you've created and that we've kind of looked through together. So for anyone listening, if you're really ready to get started looking at how these family stories might be impacting your life and working on claiming a new identity, Bernadette, tell our listeners a little bit about the Emotional Family Tree Kit that we just launched.
The Emotional Family Tree Kit is a different way of looking at your family tree. So it is not about you necessarily going back and looking for a specific ancestor to find out what happened to them. It's the opposite. It is like, what emotion is sitting in my body? What are the emotions that are sitting in my body? And kind of understanding those, and then saying, who could this have come from? Which side of my family could this feeling of not good enough, who was that? My dad's side? Was that my mom's side? You start to investigate your family tree from the emotional side first. And that allows you a way to understand before you start maybe getting more into the ancestry, is that this is an emotional journey, and when we recognize that these emotions have been passed down to us and that we are holding them, that they're in our bodies, that in itself becomes a release right away, and then it helps us to begin to take a bigger journey.
Yeah, it's a reverse engineering tool.
Yes.
It is a great thing, and say this isn't about being able to fill in the tree. It's about being able to fill in your own missing identity from the tree.
Yeah.
And how long does it take?
It is going to be one of those things, like everything, that it can take a short amount of time, or what it probably is going to do is kickstart your wanting to know more. So and you will be able to look at different sides of your family, or you can look at maybe one side of the family in several different several different generations. It really is a tool to begin the journey. So that's kind of where.
Okay, awesome. And that is downloadable on our Teachable site, and we'll have a link in the comments in this video. So again, if you're ready to kickstart your journey and understand the emotional inheritance that you have, download.
Mm-hmm. And I give an example. I help people with an example of what I went through in my family, so they'll have something to look at to help them understand how to go through the process.
Yes, and as always, if you would like for Michael and Bernadette to, if you'd like to fill it out and then meet with Michael and Bernadette to discuss it in depth, that is also available as well. So thank you for joining us again, and we will see you next week for another episode of Ancestral Healing Cafe Chats. Take care.